This happened to me and my buddy Matt around a month ago. It was late July. Matt and I had planned a camping trip to the Catskill Mountains. We were staying at my uncle's cabin, located at the edge of the Catskills about 15 miles from Tupper Lake. Both of us were really into cryptid stories and things like that. We took this trip mostly to unwind and escape the pressures of everyday life. The cabin was right next to a small stream. We arrived after a 3-hour drive and spent the first day just chilling out. There was one eerie thing about the camp. There were only a few other camps nearby, and one of them was an old, abandoned trailer, which looked like it hadn't been touched since the late 90s. My uncle told me he had never seen anyone there or noticed any lights or activity. On the first day, we went hiking and swimming. We got back to the cabin around 6 p.m. and relaxed for a bit. Around 9 p.m., we decided to light a fire. We had flashlights and a knife with us, just in case. The strange stuff didn't start happening until around 10 p.m. We went inside to grab more wood, and when we glanced toward the abandoned trailer, we saw lights glowing around it. Matt and I exchanged puzzled looks. There had to be some reasonable explanation, we figured. We decided to ignore it and went back to our fire. As we sat by the fire, we started hearing noises coming from across the creek. It sounded like branches snapping. It was as if someone, or something, was walking. We both noticed it, but whenever we pointed our flashlights toward the noise, nothing was there, and the sounds would stop. Then, around 10:30 p.m., we heard something rush through the creek, splashing in the water, and the noise moved closer to our side of the creek. We headed back to the cabin, thinking that whatever was happening had ended. But at about 11 p.m., we heard a loud bang on the cabin door. There was no way we were going to check it out. We sat there in complete silence. Then we heard footsteps moving to the other side of the cabin, and we thought it had passed. But we were mistaken. Next, we started hearing sounds on the roof. It seemed like something was crawling around up there, trying to find a way into the cabin. Eventually, the noises stopped, and we managed to fall asleep. But that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, after breakfast, we decided to go for a walk. It was a 2-mile hike along forest roads. There was only one house along this trail. The first part of the hike was uneventful. Then we reached the part where the road cut through the forest. As we were walking down a hill, we saw something. It looked like a very pale person crawling on all fours across the road. It was incredibly skinny, and if I had to guess, it stood about 6 feet tall or more when upright. It was like something out of a horror movie. It turned toward us, stared, and let out a high-pitched screech. Then it darted off the road and vanished into the woods. We bolted, running back to the cabin just in case it decided to follow us. Since then, I've done some research, and it seems like what we saw might have been a creature known as a crawler. What do you think it could have been? In 2017, a man named Rob decided to take a solo trip to his family's remote cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. He had been there many times before, especially in the summers, and enjoyed the peace and quiet that the forest brought. The cabin was miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees and completely isolated. Rob planned to spend a few days there alone, hoping to relax and clear his mind. One evening, as the sun began to set, Rob was sitting on the porch, enjoying the fresh air. That's when he noticed something strange. Off in the distance, deep in the woods, he saw a small fire. At first, he thought it might be a campfire, but it was unusual because he knew no one else should be around. The area was too remote for casual campers, and his family owned the land. He watched the fire for a while, unsure of what to think. Eventually, it died out, and Rob convinced himself it might just be a random spark or maybe someone passing through. He tried not to worry about it and headed inside for the night. As the night went on, the stillness of the forest surrounded the cabin. Rob was just about to settle in for bed when he heard something that sent a chill down his spine. Footsteps. At first, they were soft, but they quickly grew louder, as if someone was slowly walking around outside. Rob froze, listening carefully. The steps weren't fast or hurried. They were slow and deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. Rob grabbed a flashlight and turned off all the lights in the cabin. His heart was racing, but he wanted to see what was going on. He crept to the window and shone his light outside. He couldn't see anyone, but he knew he had heard the footsteps. Then came the knock. It wasn't a loud, frantic knock, but a steady, soft one, as if the person outside was testing to see if anyone was home. Rob didn't move. He stayed as quiet as possible, not daring to make a sound. The knocking continued for a while before it finally stopped. He breathed a little easier, hoping whoever it was had left. But the night wasn't over. Just as Rob started to calm down, the footsteps started again, this time moving around the cabin. It sounded like the person was circling the house, walking slowly and deliberately. Rob's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to do. He was completely alone, miles away from help, and had no cell service. The footsteps eventually faded away into the forest, but Rob stayed awake, too frightened to sleep. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the fear lingered. The next morning, as soon as the sun was up, Rob packed his things and prepared to leave. Before heading out, he took one last look around the cabin. That's when he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the ground around the cabin were clear footprints. They circled the cabin multiple times, showing that whoever was out there had been watching him for a long time. Even more unsettling, the footprints led back into the forest, in the direction of the small fire he had seen the night before. Whoever had been outside his cabin had likely been the one to start the fire, watching him from a distance all along. Shaken, Rob drove away and decided never to return to the cabin alone again. Though he never found out who the person was or what they wanted, the experience haunted him. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest things in the woods aren't animals or wild creatures, but other people with unknown intentions. In 2012, Jessica and Todd, a couple from Michigan, planned a quiet weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods. The cabin was in a remote part of northern Michigan, far away from any major roads or towns. They loved the peace and isolation, hoping to spend some quality time together away from the busyness of their daily lives. The cabin was surrounded by thick woods, and they had no neighbors nearby. The first day of their trip went smoothly. They arrived at the cabin in the afternoon, unpacked, and settled in. The area was beautiful, with tall trees and a calm atmosphere. They spent most of the day hiking on nearby trails and enjoying nature. By evening, they made a small fire outside, cooked dinner, and sat under the stars. Everything felt peaceful. As the night grew darker, they began to hear the faint sound of an engine. This was strange because the cabin was miles from any main road, and they hadn't seen any other cars during their entire stay. The sound got louder, and then suddenly, it stopped. Jessica and Todd looked at each other, feeling a bit uneasy but brushing it off, thinking maybe it was someone passing by. They decided to go to bed. Around 2 a.m., they were woken up by a loud banging on the front door. Startled, Todd got up and grabbed a flashlight. Jessica sat up, her heart pounding. The banging continued, and it didn't sound like a knock for help. It was forceful and aggressive, as if someone was trying to break in. Todd carefully walked to the window, staying low so whoever was outside couldn't see him. When he peeked out, he saw a man standing on their porch. The man looked dirty, his clothes were torn, and he seemed unstable. He was shouting something, but they couldn't make out what he was saying. Todd, being cautious, didn't open the door. Instead, he asked the man what he wanted through the window. The man didn't answer clearly. He just kept repeating that he needed help, but his behavior was strange, and he wasn't explaining what kind of help he needed. Todd felt uneasy and told the man to leave, but the man didn't move. Instead, he started banging on the door even harder, demanding to be let inside. Jessica was terrified. She grabbed her phone and tried calling the local sheriff's office, but since they were so far out, it took time to get through. Todd kept an eye on the man, who continued to act erratically. He kept pacing back and forth on the porch, sometimes banging on the door or windows. After what felt like forever, the man finally stopped and walked back to his truck, which was parked a short distance away. He got in and drove off into the night. Jessica and Todd were shaken. They didn't sleep for the rest of the night, keeping watch just in case the man came back. By early morning, the sheriff arrived. They told him what had happened, and the sheriff searched the area. He informed them that the man they had encountered had a history of violent behavior. He had been arrested recently for assault in a nearby town, but had been released shortly before their encounter. The sheriff explained that the man was likely looking for trouble or trying to find an easy target. Jessica and Todd were lucky that they didn't open the door or let him inside. Though the man never returned, the experience left a lasting mark on them. They had gone to the cabin to escape and relax, but instead, they found themselves in a dangerous situation. From that point on, they decided that they would never stay in such a remote place again without proper security and some way to contact help quickly. This experience showed them that, even in the most peaceful places, danger can come unexpectedly. Sometimes, the real terror isn't from wild animals or the wilderness itself, but from people with unknown intentions. In 2015, a group of friends decided to rent a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains for a weekend getaway. The group consisted of 4 friends: Sarah, Mike, Laura, and Chris. They wanted a peaceful break from city life, where they could enjoy nature, hike, and relax. The cabin they rented was far from any town, with no neighbors in sight and no cell service. It was surrounded by thick trees, with only a single dirt road leading in and out. The isolation felt perfect for a quiet retreat. On the first day, everything was calm and uneventful. The friends spent the day hiking along nearby trails, taking in the beauty of the forest and the fresh mountain air. They were excited to be away from the noise and stress of their busy lives. By the time they returned to the cabin, it was late afternoon. They made dinner, lit a campfire outside, and spent the evening chatting and laughing under the stars. As the night wore on, the forest around them grew darker, and the air turned cold. The fire crackled as they sat around it, enjoying the peace. But around 10 p.m., Sarah thought she saw something move in the trees just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was a quick flicker of movement, like a shadow slipping between the trees. She mentioned it to the group, but they all shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just an animal. A little while later, Laura and Chris started hearing soft rustling sounds coming from the woods. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, as if someone or something was moving through the trees, just out of sight. Mike stood up and shined his flashlight into the darkness, but they saw nothing. The rustling stopped. The friends exchanged nervous glances, but no one said anything, trying to remain calm. They told themselves it was probably just the wind or maybe a deer passing through. Eventually, they decided to go inside the cabin for the night. They locked the doors and settled in, trying to put the strange noises behind them. However, around midnight, they were all startled awake by the sound of footsteps on the porch. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy boots walking slowly across the wooden deck outside. Mike, who was the closest to the door, got up and quietly peeked through the window. What he saw made his heart race. There, standing on the porch, was a man. He was tall, with unkempt hair, wearing a dark jacket. The man didn't knock or call out. He just stood there, staring at the cabin in complete silence. Mike quickly backed away from the window and whispered to the others what he had seen. They all huddled together in fear, unsure of what to do. They didn't want to confront the man, but they also didn't want to just sit there and wait. The man didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he began to walk around the cabin, as if he were inspecting it, looking for a way inside. The group stayed quiet, holding their breath. They could hear his footsteps circling the cabin. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and the man disappeared into the woods. No one slept for the rest of the night. They were too afraid that he might come back. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, they decided to leave. When they stepped outside, they found boot prints all around the cabin, clear evidence that the man had circled the house several times during the night. There were even prints leading up to the windows. The group quickly packed their things and left the cabin, terrified by the thought of what could have happened if the man had decided to come inside. The friends never found out who the man was or what he wanted. They didn't report the incident, thinking that since nothing had happened, it wasn't worth involving the authorities. But the experience left them shaken. What was supposed to be a fun, relaxing weekend in the mountains turned into a terrifying experience they would never forget. After that, none of them ever stayed in such a remote cabin again. They learned that while the isolation of a cabin in the woods can be peaceful, it can also leave you vulnerable to unexpected dangers.